What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Latin American politics. I hope that you are just great. I hope that you had a nice weekend, that you celebrated Halloween. I'm sure that you all had great costumes and you went out and had a great time. Of course, observing social distancing guidelines and other procedures. I'm so happy that you're here. I'm so happy that we're together again, despite the circumstances. Today, we're going to finish our discussion of presidentialism in Latin America. And the way we're going to do it is by kind of evaluating presidentialism as an institution. Now, earlier in the course, we already sort of talked about presidentialism and the way it is suited or not suited to democracy. We talked about some of the problems that arise when the president and the Congress are independently elected. But I want to go into that a little bit more deeply today. And we'll face some questions about legitimacy and who speaks for the people when there are competing voices between the legislature and the president. We'll also talk about democratic dilemmas that arise when we consider how democratic presidentialism is and whether it does or does not tend to give way to powerful executives who can abuse power and can abuse other institutions. And so this is a discussion that has us thinking about Latin America from the vantage point of political institutions in democracy, checks and balances, accountability. We're really getting into some of the substantive components of democratic concepts and definitions that we've seen earlier in the course. And so I'm really excited to get started. I know that you are too. Let me go ahead and share the screen and we can get underway. So our starting point is the nature of governing in presidential systems in general. And remember that we already established that Latin American countries are notoriously presidential in that 15 of the 28 presidential systems in the world are in Latin America. And so when we define and talk about these systems in general, we're talking about the Latin American experience. And in particular, we're talking about the experience of countries that share a colonial history with Portugal or Spain. And so in these Latin American countries with presidential systems, the main role of the assembly is to legislate. Now, presidents have a number of roles in relation to the assembly, and that includes picking their cabinets, chairing cabinet meetings, but most importantly, it includes legislative powers. And so in Latin America and elsewhere, presidents typically have the capacity, the power to veto legislation that makes its way to their desk, to set the agenda, that is, identify priorities and legislative priorities, and then also to use decree powers or the power to decree legislation without the approval of the Congress. And all three of these powers are significant because they highlight the specific nature of the distribution of power in a presidential system. Remember that because the president is independently elected, they also pick their cabinets, and they also chair those cabinet meetings. Remember that in a parliamentary system, by contrast, the cabinet is a collegial body that's going to reflect the composition of the governing coalition that produced that prime minister who is the head of state. In a presidential system, much more power is concentrated in the hands of the president, who chairs the meetings as well as fills the cabinets and uses those legislative powers that will interact with the legislature. What I want you to pay attention to is the composition of the cabinets of Latin American governments. Now we have our core Latin American countries, the countries that normally find their way into our data set. And we have two columns, one for the average percentage of nonpartisan ministers, that is, ministers from a party other than the president's party. And we have another column for the average proportionality of cabinet portfolio allocation. Now, what I want you to pay attention to really is this one here, this first column. And notice that there's a significant variation from country to country. In Argentina, 7% of ministers are from parties other than the party of the president. In Bolivia, it jumps to 20%. In Brazil, it's as high as 47%. In Chile, it's about 7%. Colombia, it's about 6%. In Costa Rica, it's very low. It's only about 2%. In Ecuador, it's 65%. In Mexico, it's very low. It's about 4%. In Panama, it's 18%. In Peru, it's about 41%. In Uruguay, it's very low. It's about 1.5%. In the United States, it's zero. In Venezuela, it's about 44%. So in countries like Argentina, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Colombia, and Uruguay, cabinets are almost entirely filled by members of the president's party. And this is because ordinarily, these are relatively consolidated party systems. There are fewer parties in these systems, and it's more likely that an individual political party will win a legislative majority. And moreover, it's likely that the president's party may win a legislative majority. Now, on the other hand, we have those very fragmented party systems like Brazil, like Ecuador, and like Peru. And notice that in these cases, a much, much higher proportion of the ministers come from parties that are different than the president's party. The reason for that is because these are fragmented party systems. Any governing coalition that's put together or any support coalition that's assembled is almost invariably going to include 4 or 5 parties. And so what that means then is that the deals and the bargains that have to be worked out will involve putting non-party ministers in the cabinet of the government. And so if it's a leftist party, maybe that leftist party has to put in some center-left cabinet ministers from other parties, or maybe even some centrist cabinet ministers from other parties, in order to be able to put together a support coalition that's sturdy enough to pass the president's agenda. Now, in Ecuador, it's 65%. In Peru, it's 41%. In Brazil, it's 47%. Again, those are our most fragmented systems of all. And so it does highlight that fragmentation will be reflected in the composition of the cabinet. And I think that the US percentage is really noteworthy because, as we know, we have a 2-party system. That 2-party system, moreover, is ruled by majoritarian institutions. And so these winner-take-all rules and patterns are duplicated in the cabinet itself. And the composition of the cabinet is always entirely partisan. So if it's a Republican president, it's going to be a Republican cabinet. If it's a Democratic president, it'll be a Democratic cabinet. The last case I'll draw your attention to is the case of Costa Rica. Now, this is through 2000, this data. I told you earlier in the course that until 2002, Costa Rica had a 2-party system. That's why the percentage of nonpartisan ministers is so low in Costa Rica, because ordinarily the country has had a 2-party system, which means then that normally one of those parties will win a majority in the Congress. And normally that party is the, not always, but often that party was the party of the president. And so you can see a lot of variation here, but this variation is almost always going to be linked to party fragmentation, the consolidation of the party system, the effective number of parties more specifically. Now, before we continue, I just want to open it up to any questions that you might have when you look at this data. These are really interesting patterns, and these are consistent with what we would expect based on our understanding of the party systems in these countries. But there could be some questions that you have. Does anything stand out when you look at this data? Does anything really seem to be significant that we haven't discussed yet?
So just to recap them from what you're saying, if I'm understanding, is that countries that have a lot of parties in them, I forgot what word we use, I have to look back on my notes, but those countries have a larger percentage of non-partisan ministers in the cabinet, right? Whereas us, like the US, we don't have that, generally have low.
Right, and what you're thinking of, the word you're thinking of is party system fragmentation. So systems that are more fragmented have more parties, and they have more effective parties. And what that means then is they're going to have a larger percentage of nonpartisan ministers, because in order to assemble support coalitions, you have to build coalitions with more parties. And that means then that those other parties will get seats in the cabinet as part of the deals that have to be made to assemble that coalition.
And like for cases like Peru and like Ecuador to have her higher, um, does that mean that they have more parties then, or that's just the way it is? Like, is there any like
So
correlation between the number of parties they have?
yeah, so what I'm suggesting to you is that this is almost exclusively determined by the degree of party system fragmentation. So there's not necessarily like a law in political science that establishes this, but typically how fragmented a party system is will then influence how many nonpartisan ministers will be in the cabinet. And because remember that with more parties in the system, coalitions have to include more parties. And those parties that are in the coalition usually will get seats in the cabinet as part of the deal. They sort of join the coalition in exchange for seats in the cabinet, and then also usually some sort of agreement that the president's party will support their legislative agenda later on down the road. It's kind of like I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. And one way that they scratch backs is
Mm,
by trading cabinet seats.
okay, that makes sense.
And so this is an interesting way to think about proportional the sort of proportion of nonpartisan ministers in these cabinets. Guest asks, what year is this data from? This data is from 1970s to about 2000, about 1979 through 2000, because 1979 was the year of the first transition in Latin America, in Ecuador, during this third wave. So this data then is relatively comprehensive, but it doesn't give us the advantage of knowing what's happened since 2000. But what I would suggest to you is that you'd probably see a very similar set of outcomes. Again, there being kind of a close relation between party system fragmentation and then the percentage of nonpartisan ministers in the cabinet. Now, I said a moment ago, let me check the chat. We're getting another comment here. Maricela says, I noticed that intermediate economic developed countries besides from Peru have a low average. So Marcela, are you thinking about countries like Colombia and Costa Rica and Mexico, Uruguay? Some of these countries like Uruguay and Mexico and even Colombia to a certain extent, I would think of these as upper middle income countries. Not they're kind of beyond intermediate at this point. Now that doesn't say anything about their level of economic inequality, but Mexico and Uruguay are upper middle income countries. Colombia is as well. Um, it's an interesting consideration, the idea that there might be a relationship between level of economic development or the size of the economy and the size of the party system as measured by the number of parties. I think that, Marcella, if what you're suggesting is that more developed countries have a lower average, I think that that sounds about right. And that's what the modernization theory would suggest, by the way, too. Remember that, excuse me, I'm forgetting that I didn't actually teach you modernization theory. I think that I went over it briefly when we discussed different potential causes of transitions. But modernization theory says that how economically developed a country is determines how democratic it is, and that more developed countries will be democratic. If we think about this from the point of view of the party system and how development should affect the party system, it does suggest that more developed countries, if in Maricella's example, are intermediate, more developed countries should probably have a lower percentage of nonpartisan ministers because they should have more consolidated party systems. And so that would be reflected in a lower percentage. And that's consistent with modernization theory's expectation, which again says that development is what affects politics. Now, I said a moment ago that presidential systems are really characterized by a lot of presidential power, especially in Latin America. And one of those powers, as I mentioned, is decree power. And decree power is very important because it's power that presidents have to bypass Congress. And we need to say more about these decree powers and where they come from and how they are used. So the rules for the delegation of decree power and the creation of decree power are outlined in the Constitution. So Latin American countries going back to the early 1800s, when creating their constitutions, created a basis for decree power. And the way this works is that Congress passes legislation that lets the president decree original laws in some area. The passage of this legislation is what sort of inaugurates the power to use decrees in some specific area after it's already been laid down in the Constitution. The question arises, though, why would Congress relinquish this authority? Why would they give up this power? Presumably, that's power that they would have had themselves. At the very least, why would they give more power to the president in relation to themselves if the president already has this capacity to use decree power in the Constitution? Well, the answer to our question has a lot to do with partisan powers, and this refers to the size of the president's party in Congress. We can distinguish broadly between weak and strong presidents. It varies from country to country and from time period to time period. Strong presidents are those presidents who enjoy the support of a majority in Congress, and that majority can be either their own party or a coalition of parties. A weak president, on the other hand, is a president who does not enjoy the support of a majority in Congress. They might have a minority coalition or a minority party in support of them, but they don't enjoy a majority that they would need to pass legislation. And so when we talk about the balance of power, we're talking about the balance of partisan powers. And this is how we understand the delegation of decree authority. If you think about the possibility that the legislature and the executive are controlled by the same party, it begins to make more sense why that party in the legislature would give the executive the capacity to use decree power to impose legislation and to bypass the Congress. But it's ordinarily quite difficult to use decrees outside of a sufficient, capable, unified majority, precisely because you have an opposition that's often unified against you. And that's the same reason that you couldn't form a coalition in the first place. So it's in the end the same reason that you can't use decree power, or that you can't obtain decree power through some new legislation. So the balance of power is very important. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the balance of power is especially important as we examine the variation from country to country in Latin America. Remember that party system fragmentation affects the number of parties that are in the legislature, and it also affects in turn the number of parties that are often in a coalition that is formed to form a majority to pass legislation. What I have for you here is the differences across countries in the types of coalitions that formed in these countries across time between 1970 and 2000. And we have, again, our same key Portuguese and Spanish colonial cases, former colonies, and then we have four columns: single party majority, majority coalition, single party minority, minority coalition, and then a total that sums up the total number of coalitions or forms of governments in each of these cases. And there's a lot here, but the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the absolute dearth of single party majorities in Latin American presidencies between 1970 and 2000. You saw one in Argentina during that entire period. You saw three in Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a country that had a two-party system during this era, and still, in only 3 cases did that system produce a single party majority. That is, a majority in the legislature that was composed of a single party. 2 of these occurred in Mexico at the time. That was largely due, however, to the control of the legislature that was maintained by the PRI at that time. Remember that the PRI was an authoritarian party that was able to use patronage and corruption to maintain control of the government. We saw 2 of them in Peru, interestingly enough. We saw 2 of them in the United States. We saw 1 in Venezuela. That's a really interesting set of variations. The far more common form of government is a majority coalition that is composed of oftentimes, well, if not exclusively, multiple parties who together form a coalition. So you saw 0 of these in Argentina, you saw 4 of them in Bolivia, 11 in Brazil, 5 in Chile, 10 in Colombia, 1 in Ecuador, 3 in Panama, 4 in Peru, 6 in Uruguay, 1 in the United States, and 1 in Venezuela. You also saw single party minorities. This is where a single party forms a minority coalition, and the extent of the government's support is a single party minority or a minority coalition. This occurred less often, but still occurred a total of 18 times across our cases. And then finally, even more common than a single party minority is a minority coalition. And this is a minority that is composed of multiple parties, not one party, multiple parties. And this was represented 31 times in the data set. The single most common type is the majority coalition. The majority coalition consists of multiple parties by definition. The second most common type is the minority coalition, also consists of multiple parties. This data represents, in general, the ways that party fragmentation affects democratic politics. It forces governments to form coalitions. It leaves them virtually always without a single party majority, and it forces them to work together with other parties in order to pursue their agendas. This is a kind of dynamic that makes presidentialism difficult to sustain, because it means that very seldom is there a lot of agreement between the president and the legislature. Instead, there's a constant search for some kind of negotiated settlement or some kind of bargain or deal that can be struck. And when you have multiple parties, there are a lot of moving parts. Each party has to be sort of satisfied anew when a new coalition partner is added to the mix, and so on and so forth. And in countries like Ecuador and Peru, where there are constant elite conflicts inside parties, you see an especially large number of minority coalitions, precisely because those parties are so often kind of collapsing as those elites peel off and form all new parties. And so this is really telling data, because it shows you that, generally speaking, governments don't enjoy single party majority support. Instead, they have to work really hard to put together coalitions. And those coalitions themselves are very fragile. This helps us to understand some of the failures of governance, some of the failures of democratic representation, some of the challenges to Latin American democracies. When we talk about strengthening institutions, what we're talking about is getting systems to a place where they don't have to rely so continuously on these minority coalitions and these single party minorities, and frankly, even these majority coalitions. Now, we've talked about a number of different ways of looking at some of the consequences of presidential systems in the way that presidentialism takes shape in Latin America. Let's take a look at an actual case. This is our first case for today. We will address some more cases as we go forward, but this is just the case of Chile. Chile is a case characterized by perhaps the most profound executive powers of all. Here's a country where the president alone enjoys the power to introduce legislation, where the president can call a plebiscite or demand a session of Congress, where the president can participate in lawmaking actively through the use of a variety of veto powers, agenda powers, decree powers. The president, like in other presidential systems, is directly elected, serves a 4-year term, and is ineligible for consecutive re-election. The executive branch is headed by the president, who's also in charge of not just legislative issues and initiating legislation, but also, of course, military and state and security issues, and the whole panoply of the territorial dimensions of governing a state that we associate with the head of state. Of course, the ministers of state approve all decrees, but because Chile is a relatively consolidated party system between left and right, at least historically, it means that most cabinets have been formed primarily by members of the party. And so that means then that not only do Chilean presidents have extensive decree power, they also usually have cabinets that are very compliant and willing to approve their decrees. And I'll go back and I'll show you the average percent of nonpartisan ministers in Chile. It's only 6.7%. And so that means a lot. That's an important number, because it means then that these presidents pictured here are normally able to use their decree power effectively. They're not stopped by the other ministers in their cabinets in the same way that they might, for example, be stopped in a country like Ecuador or even Argentina, where historically cabinets have included members from multiple parties. Now, here are some presidents from Chile since 1990. These are all interesting figures. This one, this one, this one, and this one are all from the left. This one's from the right. This is Sebastian Pinera. He's been elected twice, um, and he's still in power. This is Michelle Bachelet. She was elected twice as well. And this is Ricardo Lagos. I'm forgetting who these two are. Forgive me, I should know. Here's a fun fact. I actually had an interview set up with Michelle Bachelet. I was supposed to meet with her and discuss the politics of a certain reform process and some pieces of legislation. And I was in touch with her team and sent along letters and my CV and a list of questions and the questionnaire that I would use. And the way it was going to work was she was going to return from an international engagement. She's currently the United Nations' head human rights advisor. And she was going to return to Chile when I was there doing field work in 2018 at this time, 2018. Yeah. And well, long story short, I was never able to meet with her. It kind of fell through. I don't know if they didn't like the questions I was going to ask. It was sort of a sensitive issue, and she was kind of on the wrong side of the issue when she was president. And so I wasn't surprised that in the end they didn't speak to me. But I had it all set up, and it looked like it was going to happen. And I think they approved it before they got their hands on my questionnaire. But anyway, I really wish I could have interviewed her. I got to her people anyway, and I figured out what happened. But in the end, it was disappointing that I didn't have a chance to talk to her. But Chile is an example of powerful presidents who control the process. And in addition to these powers, traditionally have been able to, for example, move funding from agency to agency within the government without legislative approval. And in addition, have had substantial influence over the legislative process. So there's quite a bit here in the case of Chile. Now, we've talked about the data. We've talked about how party system fragmentation affects composition of governments and presidential systems. We've talked about weak and strong presidencies in Latin America. We've talked about the example of Chile and how presidential powers work in practice. But the most interesting topic of discussion when it comes to presidentialism is something we haven't addressed yet. And this is the set of dilemmas of democracy that arise when we talk about presidentialism. And the first dilemma, and probably the most important one, and the one that we'll talk about for several minutes going forward, is the problem of dual legitimacy. And this comes directly from the nature of independent survival. Now, remember that the defining feature of a presidential system is that the president and the Congress are both directly elected. They're both directly elected by the voters, by us. And what that means then is that they each can claim to be the voice of the people. They both have a claim to democratic legitimacy, to be the voice of the people in the most representative way possible, because they were, after all, elected by the people. And Juan Linz, who wrote about the dilemmas of presidential democracy, had this to say: who, on the basis of democratic principles, is better legitimated to speak in the name of the people, the president or the congressional majority that opposes his policies? Since both derive their power from the vote of the people, a conflict is always latent and sometimes likely to erupt dramatically. There is no democratic principle to resolve it. This is the problem of dual democratic legitimacy, and this is a problem that is particular to presidential systems, and Latin American systems in particular are prone to dual democratic legitimacy because of the ways that powers have been concentrated in the hands of presidents in those countries. And so one example of dual democratic legitimacy comes from the case of Venezuela. Now, you know that Venezuela is a dictatorship today, and that it's been one basically since about roughly 2014, when a referendum to recall Maduro was canceled by the Maduro administration, and especially since 2017, when the Maduro administration seized power from the Congress and gave it to the Supreme Court. But between the period of about 2009 or 10 and 2014, Venezuela had what we could call a dual power situation, because there was a direct conflict between the opposition-controlled National Assembly, which opposed the Socialist Party and the socialist government of Maduro, and the executive branch, which was, of course, controlled by Maduro and the Socialist Party, both of which claimed to be the voice of the people, both of which having been directly elected by the people. This was before the Maduro administration began stealing elections, and began canceling referendums. And so it was a period where there was still at least an element of competition involved. This was a dual power situation. It was a problem of dual democratic legitimacy, this conflict between an opposition controlled legislature who refuses to cooperate with the socialist executive branch controlled by the Maduro administration, which itself refuses to cooperate with the assembly. How do we resolve this difference? Who speaks for the people in a situation like this? Is it the president or is it the legislature? This is the classic debate, and this is the debate that we'll take on here in a moment. And what I want you to think about is the possibility that there's no right answer to this question, in that there are actually arguments on both sides, in that one of the characteristic limitations of presidentialism might be that it can give rise to this problem of dual legitimacy. Now, I want to read you a quote from a different case that also helps to highlight this. This is the case of Peru under Alberto Fujimori, who you also know well by now. He said the following, commenting on his popularly supported April 5th, 1992 dissolution of Congress. He said, "Do you really believe that with that elephant-like Congress we had before April 5th, it was feasible to effect a deep reform? How many laws did that Congress produce? You count how many laws Congress produced. We can expect absolutely nothing. This is the reality all the people recognize." This was his commentary after carrying out his auto coup, or his takeover and seizure and dissolution of the Congress in 1992. This was a very dramatic event. And this quote highlights this conflict and this tension between the two, and the way that Fujimori, an outsider, viewed himself as entirely independent from the Congress, and what's more, viewed himself as above the Congress, despite that the Constitution in Peru outlined the checks and the balances between the two branches that were supposed to operate. Now, what's really interesting about this debate and about this set of disagreements is that it raises a really important question, which is, who does speak for the people in Latin American countries? Oh, is it the president or is it the congressional majority? And one way that we attack this question, well, first we think about what we think and what our opinion might be. But what I'd like us to do today is a little bit different. I want us to work together in our groups that I'll put you in. And by the way, I'm watching the number of participants, so don't leave now that I've mentioned groups. And I want you to list arguments in favor of the president being the voice of the people, and I want you to list arguments in favor of the congressional majority being the voice of the people. And I want you to think about the way that democracy works and what we value and what we want from democracy, and whether the president being in charge or the congressional majority being in charge does a better job of getting us closer to what we value and what we like about democracy. So I'm going to go ahead and put you in some rooms, and we're going to take about 5 minutes to discuss this. And I want you to be loose with this. Just jot down arguments for each of the two positions, and be prepared to share your perspective when we get back together. This is the first half of the course for today. We will spend some time discussing this. Once we're done, we'll set out on an analysis of some of the precise presidential powers, and then we'll address some questions that relate to those. And so I'm going to go ahead and take care of those rooms, and we'll get going. All right, I'm creating 8 rooms. Um, I don't know if there's a problem. Let me try that again. Okay, there we go. Sorry, everybody. It should work now.
Professor, I don't know what happened with the break room. I was in, and I'm the only one there. I don't know what happened.
You're the only one there. Okay, so let me assign you to a new one. All right, everybody, I'm closing the rooms and we're going to reconvene, okay? And as we get back together, I want you to get ready to share what you discussed. And I want us to have a robust debate. This is a question that lends itself to many different perspectives too. And there are many good arguments on both sides. And I'm telling you right up front, I don't know which side who has the voice. I think that there are good arguments to be made on both sides. And so let's begin to discuss this as we get back together. Only 15 of us are here, by the way. That's interesting. There were so many others here before. I don't know if people are still in the rooms.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Like, I was telling you, Professor. I don't know what happened with the break room I was in, and then like everything like stopped working. I don't know.
Okay.
Both here.
Sorry about that, Abel. It looks like people are getting back in now. I think that maybe my internet is slow, or maybe just Zoom is kind of acting up. But let's hear from some people. What do you all think?
Hello.
Hi, Sarah.
In our group, we brought up the fact that a congressional majority reflects the population more than the president, because of the fact that there's so many positions and the president is just one person, and also the frequency of which they are removed and replaced in office.
Okay, great. Great. I'm writing this down, and I'm going to keep tabs on the arguments that students and groups make. And I'm also going to write down the type of argument. So one really good point so far from Sarah's group is that the congressional majority might be more representative of the nation as a whole. And that could be really consequential. And I think that you said some other stuff too, Sarah, about re-election. Can you say that again?
Yes, we just talked about how there's a more frequent rotation of individuals in the congressional majority that, or in congressional like groups. So maybe while the president may be longer, the views of the public have changed.
Okay, that's so good. Excellent. Let's hear from some others.
So I came up with a few arguments during the session for
Okay.
both sides. So for the president, I have that they're usually elected with a majority or a plurality of all people, whereas a legislature is just a majority of one particular constituency. So they're not, while they're representing more of the diversity of the nation, to have the majority of the people would be under the president. The second thing that I have is that audience costs for a president are normally greater than for individual legislators. Because if the president runs on a um, particular program or law that they want to write and they don't get it done, then the people know, like, okay, this guy said he was going to do something and didn't do it, so we'll get in the other guy. Whereas it's harder for people to sort of get away with blaming like an individual legislator when it's like, oh wait, the other party was involved, or that sort of thing becomes more difficult.
I see.
Whereas for the legislature, the legislature can't usually get demagogued in the way that a president can. So if a president wants to sort of like stop like Congress, it's a lot easier, I think, than a Congress stopping a president, but that could just be because there's more examples of the former than the latter. But one authoritarian figure in the presidency is more of an issue than one authoritarian in the legislature.
So that would be an argument for the legislature then.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. I had
No, I just wanted to
arguments for both sides.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's so excellent. So just to recap, Ishan says that the president has to win. Well, in some cases, a president can win with a plurality, but I think the point holds, which is that the president normally is going to win with a larger plurality or a larger majority than the coalition or the party in Congress does. So if it's a coalition in Congress who together, represent 5 or 6 parties, sure, maybe those 5 or 6 parties have a majority of the vote, but they weren't directly elected or sort of favored by the voters who voted for them in the way that that president might have won a direct plurality or a direct majority. So that's a very good argument. There's a majority in support of that president, electorally speaking, which is where their popular mandate comes from. Ishan also said that presidents have higher audience costs, which means that it's easier for those presidents to get pointed out if they fail to enact the legislation that they would. Whereas in a legislature, it's easy to shirk responsibility if you're one party or one legislator in a larger coalition. Very good argument as well. And then on the legislative side, we might argue, as Ishan suggested, that well, the legislature is going to be less vulnerable to authoritarian takeovers than the executive. And so maybe the legislature is more bulletproof from the point of view of democracy. And so maybe it's more representative in that way, or it's more sort of um, robust in that way. Sarah's group mentioned that representation is going to be broader in the legislature. All of these arguments are excellent arguments, but I can think of other points that we could make as well. Can we hear from some others?
So for the first group I was in, we said the congressional majority would be like a better reflection of the democracy, just because there's like, I mean, the president also has checks and balances, but I think when it comes to the congressional majority, there is a lot more people that have to like decide, and there's more of a, I guess there's more of like a team effort when it comes to like the congressional majority, rather when it's the president, like he could always like veto stuff or like push through with his agenda. Like even if it's like in a corrupt way, I think it's like easier for the president to do that. So I think for us, the congressional majority would be a more better reflection of a democracy where there's like a little more checks and balances there. But I had a question for the president majority. If like the president is picked by because of the majority, like that's like where I have like a little bit of a conflict understanding. Like if the president is chosen by the majority, like I need help connecting the majority and the president kind of there.
So the president is picked by the voters. The president is not picked by the legislative majority. The
Okay,
legislative
yeah,
majority,
that's where I was like having a bit of like a problem
yeah.
understanding and connecting that point there.
Does that help explain it?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
No problem. And Clarissa, that's a really good point that your group came up with. The idea that the legislative process, because the legislature has fewer powers as compared to the president, maybe, for example, not having like decree power, the process is going to be more involved and there will be more stages in approving legislation. And so that means then that there might be more opportunities for different groups or different representatives of different groups to have a say. And from that perspective, that could be more democratic, especially in a country like Ecuador or Peru, where we have a lot of different groups and there are a lot of different interests involved. And it's a process of negotiating those differences. Decree power is kind of like, all you have is a hammer and everything looks like a nail. Maybe the legislature is more nuanced and better able to capture the whole range of identities and interests that we would find in a place like Ecuador or Peru or even Bolivia. Very good. Good. I'd like to hear from anyone else who wants to add what they came up with. I'm going to read some of the comments in the chat, but if you are a person who wants to speak, please interrupt or grab the floor. I will promptly give you the mic. I do want to stimulate as much contribution as I can, and I know that a lot of us are still thinking. So let me just kind of read some of this commentary in the chat. One student says, I would say that having the president speak on the behalf of the people might get things done because he or she can order an executive order to get it done. So decree power or executive orders can be part of the equation. And if the legislature is obstructing the legislative agenda of a president who's quite progressive and speaking on the behalf of the people and their needs, maybe a decree is a valuable way of governing. I could also see it working the other way, where decree power could be abused in the name of concentrating power and maybe bypassing the Congress and bypassing the people if the people oppose that agenda or that piece of legislation. But that's a very interesting point. It kind of depends on who the good guy and who the bad guy is, right? And maybe not everyone is good or bad, and maybe they're both good. But you can imagine, for instance, an oppositional legislature that stops a freely elected president who might just not have a very big party in the legislature from pursuing an agenda that could really help people. You could also imagine a president using decree power to make changes that don't help people and that are designed to bypass the legislature. We'll talk about some of those cases here in a few minutes. 80, I would love to hear from you, and I know that the whole class wonders if maybe you have any ideas. So 80 has already suggested that legislative support for presidential policies and programs, a president may face either minor or major opposition in the legislature of his or her country, depending on the issue. And so I think 80, my question for you is, does that opposition or that legislative opposition, does that mean that the legislature speaks for the people, or does that mean that the president speaks for the people? How do you think the possibility of opposition might affect, who really is the most credible leader here in this situation?
I'm feeling that the answer to this question varies on your support of either the president. For example, like if you oppose a president, then you're obviously going to favor Congress and vote for Congress because it's easier to get people in and out. And, as we mentioned, like people's view on the world changes. But I feel like if you reason with the president that you have, then you would submissively just say, yeah, the president is my voice. And so therefore, I'm with him. So I think maybe that's how I feel about it.
Yeah. So maybe, like, if we're being frank, like maybe it depends on whether we like the president or dislike the president, or like the legislature or dislike the legislature. And that could have to do with ideology. That could have to do with, issues or things like that. Certainly, Leonardo, I think that it does weigh a lot on that. And what I've appreciated is that some of you have tried to put that aside. Like Joel says, for example, ideological mixture in Congress to add to the point of democracy representation. So a coalition in Congress, especially in a Latin American country that consists of, multiple political parties, that is going to represent a range of different views. And in that regard, it's more inclusive than maybe a single party presidency, where at best the composition of the cabinet might reflect that partisan diversity, but where power is ultimately concentrated in the hands of that executive. Delianor says, I think there is a greater representation of the people in the congressional majority, and we have learned from Trump that power in the wrong hands is dangerous. You can do a lot of damage or good in 4 years. Absolutely, Delianor. And I think what you're pointing out is that, who is the president can also matter, right? And we've talked about, for instance, outsider presidents and how they're more common in Latin America. They're common in general in the Americas. And Trump has actually been compared to a lot of the outsider presidents from Latin America. And the similar point has been made, which is that, as you point out, too much power in their hands or a recklessness about them can really be destructive. But again, it might depend on your view and your politics. But I think one thing we agree on is that one thing that's different about a legislature is that it does comprise a wider range of voices. It does represent a wider range of groups in society. And also importantly, as Sarah's group pointed out, this is really important, there's often a more frequent turnover. There's more rotation. And what that means then is that you get people in and you get people out. And oftentimes those shorter terms that they fulfill will mean that people have more choice and more frequently, and they can create a legislature that is more to their liking. So for instance, in the US, we have House of Representative elections every 2 years. And so those representatives are campaigning all the time. And so theoretically, they have to appeal to voters more directly and more consistently and more continuously than does the president, who can be reelected, but who frankly doesn't face the same set of incentives because they don't have to be reelected for another 4 years. So there's really a lot of different ammunition on both sides. You can think of examples that seem to support the president viewpoint. You can think of examples that seem to support the party viewpoint. And what I wanted you to take from this is that it kind of depends. And we can think about how democracy is served relatively well or not so well by, by those conditions. And ideally, you should be able to make arguments on both sides, and you should be able to kind of think like a devil's advocate and contest or critique your own perspective. Now, we've talked about Latin American presidencies in the context of a general analysis of presidentialism. We've talked about how dual legitimacy arises, especially in Latin America, because of the powers of the presidents. But we haven't actually talked about what those powers are yet. And that's what we'll do now. We'll address the 6 particular powers that really set Latin American presidents apart from US presidents. The starting point for this discussion is that the United States is very similar to Latin America in that the systems are presidential democracies. The difference, however, is that Latin American presidents have far greater lawmaking power. They have much more authority. And we'll see what that means in practice here in a moment. But before we do, we'll take a moment to talk about why that is the case. Why is it that these presidents are so powerful, especially relative to, American presidents in the office of the American president, currently filled by Donald Trump, who here is speaking to Peña Nieto, the former president of Mexico, sorry. But why is it that Latin American countries have these strong presidents? Well, it's because of the characteristics of the post-independence period. Remember that when Latin American countries became independent, their first task was writing constitutions and trying to establish political order in these places that were so unorganized and so violent. And those constitution writers, they anticipated a lot of disorder and violence. And so they created strong presidents in order to sort of suppress that violence and kind of contain it. So take it from Simón Bolívar, who in 1819 had the following to say to the Assembly of Angostura in Venezuela. He said the following: "We must never forget that the excellence of government lies not in its theories, not in its form or mechanism, but in its being suited to the nature and character of the nation for which it is instituted." And what he meant is to say that, look, this is the wild, wild west. Well, it was probably more disorderly than that because of how violent it was. But his point was to say that these are violent places, and we have to concentrate power in the hands of the executive so that we can suppress and contain this violence. And Bolivar would make the same sort of speech to multiple assemblies in many different countries of Latin America. And his view that strong presidents were essential was duplicated over and over and over again. And it seems to remain a part of Latin American politics to this day. So the 6 powers of Latin American presidents that we will discuss include the following: partial vetoes, amendatory observations, the power to introduce legislation, call a referendum, initiate an urgency petition, and then decree powers. These are all powers enjoyed by Latin American presidents, but not by their American counterparts. Now that's important because this is where we begin to really differentiate Latin American presidencies from American ones. Remember that these systems, while similar, have their own characteristics. And this is where Latin American style presidentialism begins to show itself. So in the United States, the president does have a block veto. That means they can delete an entire bill. But they don't have what we call a partial veto. This is where a president can delete portions of a bill in addition to deleting an entire bill. This is important because a partial veto doesn't just end the debate. It forces a further debate within the Congress. It raises the prospects for an outcome different from the original bill proposed by the Congress, or it raises the prospects for a change relative to the status quo. This partial veto is really important because it means then that the president can begin a sort of dialogue or a dynamic or a relationship with the Congress that won't end abruptly in the form of a block veto. Latin American presidents typically enjoy this partial veto in addition to that block veto. And so they'll use this partial veto whenever they see fit, and often in order to try to change the eventual outcome in Congress without pulling the entire bill. Elvis asks, isn't that like the line item veto? I think it's technically similar, but a partial veto is a little bit different. And it, it gets kind of technical when we get into the details. And so I'm not going to claim to know the technical and legal aspects of the line item veto, but it's safe to say that American presidents don't have a partial veto. And we do distinguish between a line item veto and a partial veto. The second presidential power is what we call an amendatory observation. And this is a presidential power where a president can return a bill to Congress with remarks. These include substitutions, additions, or deletions. So in Uruguay in 2000, for example, the executive added an additional 156 articles to the 5-year budget bill. And that was a substantial expansion of the bill. And it was a way for the executive to insert its own priorities into what was an existing piece of legislation, and a significant one that would span 5 years. Now, the amendatory observation also goes back to the days of Bolivar. It first appeared in the 1826 Constitution of Bolivia, which was drafted by Bolivar himself. And then it appeared in the Constitution of Peru shortly thereafter. But the amendatory observation is another form of presidential power that is distinctive, again, because it leads to this engagement between the executive and the legislature that's not as commonplace and is not set up to work the same way in other presidential democracies. So this is another presidential power that's distinctive. Thanks, Joel. Enjoy your vote. Vote early and vote often.
How much can they change before it's like a whole new different bill?
I think technically they can change as much as they want, or as much as is feasible, within a specific period of time. And so typically there's like a certain window for these bills, or when they need to be approved. So like a budget bill, for instance, there's usually like a deadline. So I think that only constraints usually relate to what is politically relevant, or what is a relevant window of time for the president or for the party in Congress, especially if it's the party's president or the president's party. I don't have technically an exact answer to your question, but as far as I know, there's not actually a limit on how much they can change the bill. I think usually the only limits will be imposed by the political setting. And again, that usually has to do with time and other questions about what's relevant to re-election for the president and for the president's party. The third presidential power is the power to introduce legislation. Now, the US Constitution forbids presidents from introducing legislation. All of the most well-known pieces of legislation originated in the Congress itself. The Affordable Care Act, Social Security Act, et cetera, all of them, they have to by law. But Latin American constitutions give presidents this power. Some presidents actually have the exclusive right to introduce bills. And that's the example of Chile, for instance, where no legislator can introduce a bill that implies an added expense. And so if any bill implies an expense, it has to be legislation introduced by the government. So any economic reform or economic policy, in addition to a military policy or virtually anything else that relates to governing the country, it has to be introduced by the president. Some constitutions allow only the president to propose a budget and limit congressional modifications. And so in this case, the presidential power to introduce legislation is more circumscribed and more limited. But even so, the budget is such a significant component, and the limiting of congressional modifications to the executive's budget is also significant, because it means that the president retains a lot of control over the eventual outcome. And so these countries include like Brazil, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela. In all of these countries, presidents have less power than they do in Chile, but they have the capacity to introduce budget bills and then largely limit the amount of changes made by the Congress. Another power is the power to call a referendum. And this is power by which a president can call for a general vote by the electorate on a single political question that has been referred to them for a direct decision. And so referendums in Latin American countries are common. especially when it comes to deciding on the possibility of re-election for a president if the Constitution forbids it, or a referendum called to reform or rewrite the Constitution. These are both very common types of referendums. What's significant about both of them is that a referendum is a direct appeal to the electorate. So the president can appeal directly to voters through the referendum itself, through the election. And these can be used by presidents to circumvent opposition in Congress for exactly this reason. So if a president can't find the support in Congress because they don't have a majority coalition, they don't have a sufficient legislative support, well, they can reach out to the public itself. And a referendum can be a way to kind of create an electoral mandate for some kind of change that couldn't be obtained or achieved through the normal legislative means. Now, if that sounds a little shady to you, it's because it is. And this is where we begin to talk about some of the limits of presidential democracy and some of the ways that presidential powers can be abused. And in a moment, and also on Wednesday, we'll look at some examples of some of those abuses in the way that Latin American democracies can kind of become what we sort of refer to as delegative democracies because of how much power is delegated to the president through these types of means. The fifth power is the urgency petition. And this is kind of like decrees, but relates more closely to the amount of time that the assembly is given to consider a bill introduced by a president or introduced by the Congress. This is usually 30 or 45 days, and it's a limit on how much time can go by before the Congress acts. In countries like Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Paraguay, and Uruguay, if Congress does not reject the bill in the time allotted for consideration, it becomes law. And so that's really significant because think about, for example, what happens if a president introduces a bunch of legislation and uses a bunch of urgency petitions to try to overwhelm the legislature and impose legislation? Well, in some countries, presidents have done this. And it's sometimes a serious issue because, again, it gets to that question of delegative democracy and how much power is being concentrated in the hands of the executive. There are some limits for this reason, though. So countries like Ecuador, Paraguay, and Uruguay all have limits on what kinds of bills can be subject to an urgency petition. Ecuador has a limit that confines it to economic policy. Paraguay limits it to 3 times during the legislative session. So it's designed to limit that overwhelming number that I mentioned. And then Uruguay does not allow it to be applied to budget bills. And so these are all examples of some of the limits that are placed on urgency petitions. But the general point is that presidents can sometimes use this power to bypass the legislature if the legislature is not able to act and respond effectively in the time allotted. Now, the fifth and final presidential power is really one of the most important ones of all, and this is decree power. This is power by which executives can draft and implement new laws and do so entirely without the consent or approval or involvement of the legislature. Now, I remember when I learned about decree laws as a political science major, and I was just stunned. It seemed to me to be a breach of democracy to give this power to presidents when the whole point of the legislature is to act as a check and a body involved in approving legislation, whatever that legislation is. In Latin America, because of the history of violence and disorder, because of the legacy of strong executives, there's a real sort of practice of using and supporting and creating decree powers. And so there are 2 types. There's the emergency decree authority that can be gained after declaring a state of exception in reaction to civil unrest or urgent situations. So after the massive uprising in October 2019 in Chile, for several months or a couple months, there was a state of emergency in play. I think it was a couple months, maybe it was shorter than that. But this is an example of emergency decree authority. Standard decree authority allows executives to issue decrees outside the umbrella of existing legislation and despite the situation on the ground. It doesn't have to be an emergency. So standard decree authority relates to like decrees issued by Hugo Chavez during his reign in the early 2000s and the early 2010s when he issued literally thousands of decrees. And it got to a point where virtually any governance that took place was from him decreeing legislation. And so that example of Hugo Chavez is noteworthy because it's an example of the presidential abuse of power. Now, say what you want about Chavez and his policies and the benefits that he created for the working classes. Putting aside the fact that Venezuela is a humanitarian crisis today, we can also critique his politics and the way that he behaved politically. In Venezuela in 1961, the Constitution did give executives pre-approval decree authority, but this power has been abused and was abused by Chavez. Now, after being elected in 98, he tried to expand that authority through the rewriting of the Constitution, and he significantly expanded it to the point that in some instances, he was able to promulgate as many as 26 decrees in a single day. And this is this was what happened in August 2008 at the end of an 18-month enabling period that had been designed itself to create opportunities for him to use decree power. So this is an example of the abuse of power and the use of power to bypass the legislature. Another example is Rafael Correa of Ecuador, who ruled from 2006 to 2017. Now, in Ecuador as well, the constitutions grant the executive post-approval decree authority to send urgent bills or proyectos urgentes to Congress. Congress has 30 days to act or it becomes law. In 2009, Correa, in his Alianza País, the country alliance, they lacked a party majority in the Congress, and the coalition, other parties would not support the president's bills. And so Correa began using proyectos urgentes to try to bypass the Congress and to try to push through his agenda items in a way that would prevent them from being stopped by the legislature. This is another example of an abuse of power, an effort to use the presidential powers given to him to bypass other democratic institutions. Now we'll discuss one last example before I let you go, and that's the example of AMLO in Mexico, who's been in power since 2018. Now, in the case of AMLO, he's primarily used referendums, and he's used referendums to try to appeal directly to voters, to try to legitimate and kind of prop up and support a lot of his own ambitions that the Congress has been less supportive of. And so those include infrastructure projects, indigenous rights bills, reducing salaries of bureaucrats. He even offered asylum to ousted Bolivian President Evo Morales. These were all topics for referendums that he called for. And he even plans to call a referendum in 2022 to determine if he could and should continue as president through 2024. And what's noteworthy about this case is that in addition to calling for these referendums, AMLO has also weakened considerably certain state institutions that are in charge of coordinating elections, the same elections that would be involved in the referendum process for each of these different issues. And so in Mexico, we see the abuse of power as well. And the abuse of power takes the form of not just decree authority and the abuse of a decree authority, but also referendums, also urgent projects, urgency petitions, so on and so forth. This is the nature of presidential power in Latin America when it's abused or when it's used too extensively or it's used to bypass other democratic institutions. Now we are out of time, but I will return to this on Wednesday before we start a new topic. And what we'll discuss before we start that new topic relates to how Latin American presidencies are more prone than the United States to kind of undermining democracy. And we'll conceive of this in terms of delegative democracy, which is where presidents emerge as controlling forces who can bypass other institutions. And so thank you very much for being here, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording.